Well, good morning and Shabbat Shalom and welcome. This is Valley Beth Shalom Torah study for a Shabbos morning. I'm Rabbi Ed Feinstein, joined this morning by my dear friends and teachers, Rabbi Marc Gellman of South Florida today, and Rabbi Sherre Hirsch of West Los Angeles at American Jewish University. Good morning, both of you, and welcome back and happy Unchag.
Happy
This is our
Unchag.
first week in 4 weeks, which we have not celebrated a holiday. And as much as we love our holidays and cherish them and cherish the opportunity to see our communities, that's right. There comes a time, as Kohelet said, there's a time to celebrate holidays, and there's a time to put the holiday dishes away, take down the sukkah, and get into the new year. So this morning is the beginning of the beginning, because Simchas Torah was this last week. This morning, we opened the Torah from the very beginning, and we read the opening chapters, the beginning of the world, Breshit bara Elohim, et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. The famous first Rashi on this Torah portion, Rashi, Rabbi Shlomo ben Yitzchak, Solomon Isaacson of the 11th century in France, the most famous Bible commentator in the history of the Jewish people. Rashi begins by quoting a famous midrash from the 3rd century, which asks the question, why on earth does the Torah begin here? Why does the Torah begin with the beginning? Rabbi Yitzchak in the Midrash says the Torah should have begun with the first laws given to the people of Israel. What do we need this opening story for? And that's the question I'd like to address today. Ma tam patach b'Breshit? Why does the Torah open with Breshit? So Sherry, we begin again. We begin the new year. The cycle of seasons is starting over again. We've sent our kids off to school. I know your son is back to college and your daughter is applying to college. The seasons are beginning to change. Even here in California, it's a little crisp in the morning now. What is this season? What does this moment of starting again mean?
Well, I've been thinking a lot about To Begin Again, which is a book that Naomi Levy wrote, Rabbi Naomi Levy. If you haven't read it, it's beautiful. But I haven't been thinking about it in the way that she writes about it. I've been thinking about a restart. Like, what does it mean to restart our engine, to restart our thinking, to restart our relationships? We're in this continuum of a relationship, work. What does it mean to pause this week and say, I'm going to restart? I'm going to look at it from, and maybe it's a reboot, maybe it's a restart. It's what does it mean to begin again? And I've been thinking a lot about it because we get into patterns and we think this is how it has to be. And what does it mean to actually say, like, actually, I want to look at this relation and I want to restart. What came before is from before, and what's going to start now is something new. And it's not just, we do it with our diets and we think that's standard. Like, oh, I'm going to restart on Monday. I'm going to restart on after the holidays. But what does it mean to restart our relationships, to restart our relationship with God, with others, and with ourselves?
Great question. And even it occurs to me, interesting, by the way, that the whole language of reboot is a language that's only existed for the last, 20 years or so. But the idea that you finish a certain moment and we start again. Mark, what does restarting mean?
It's so funny because our TV didn't work yesterday. So the only tech thing that I really know is the only spiritual thing I know, which is turn it off, wait a minute, and then turn it on again.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the only way to fix the TV. It reboots automatically. And that's the only way to fix me, which is Yontif, I turn off and I'm into my spiritual universe. And then I start again. I turn myself on again. And I say, what do I look like now? I have a file in my computer called the oven, where I have hundreds of old ideas and sermons and books and things that I haven't done yet. And the reason I haven't done them is they need to bake a while. They need I need to turn myself off from the creative process of making these things and put them away and then take them back. And I think what rebooting does is it gives you new eyes and it gives you new ways to see things, even though you saw them before. It's hard to explain why that is, but it's true. you look at it and you say, wait, I didn't see that that had potential, or I didn't see that that really isn't going anywhere. And I think the same is true with relationships and with the way we live in the world. But there's another piece to rebooting, and that is I still have my old TV, right? I'm rebooting that old TV. I'm rebooting this computer. I'm rebooting this life. And so I think the focus, and I think we are guilty of this on Yom Tov, of talking, oh, we're going to turn again, renew and change and new. But I think the other part of it is, no, I need to accept the fact that I'm still me. I'm rebooting me. There's something that's continuous over it, and that connects to creation. Because what's continuous about the world we live in is that it was created by God, it is created by God, and it will be continually created by God. So we're in a universe of creation in which we honor what can't change because it's continuous, and we honor what we can change in the partnership with creation.
That's beautiful.
That is beautiful.
That's a really beautiful thing. I remember my parents had their 25th anniversary. I was in college and I was in Northern California. I flew down to surprise them, and my brothers and I took them out to dinner. And we sat with my folks in this very expensive restaurant, which was unusual for us. We usually stayed on the other side of the spectrum. And we looked at our parents, and they were glowing. It was this wonderful thing. They were glowing. And we sort of said, Mom, Dad, what's going on? And my mother had this big smile on her face, and she looked at my dad, and she just said, we've started all over again. And they had this moment of renewal in their marriage. And like, it was almost embarrassing because they were very affectionate with each other all of a sudden, which we weren't used to. And their lives began again, and they began to enjoy their lives and enjoy their marriage.
Eddie, did they say how they did that? Because I think a lot of people want to be able to say, what happened in the past is in the past. Let's go forward anew. And they don't know what that trigger is, or what are those tools that they need in order to do that.
I honestly don't know. I've counseled many couples, and sometimes this happens. It's what Marc said. There's a continuity. They're still married to each other, same people, and yet they found a new level of love and affection and appreciation for each other. They changed the way they use their time. They started really spending time with each other and on each other, which was unusual for them. Up until then, it was always sacrifices made for the kids. And now suddenly they began taking care of themselves. But most of all was this sense of somehow they woke up to each other. They woke up to how much they appreciated each other and how much they loved each other. So this idea of beginning again, I think, of restarting, is such a powerful, beautiful thing.
It's so beautiful. And it's also like leaning into the good. I've said this before, but like what I say to my children is, if you want to get a criticism about dinner, give 3 compliments first. And they can't be, you're pretty, you're young, and you're thin, right? They have to be real. And so what I say to them often is like, lean into the good. And I think to restart sometimes, like, obviously, I'm not talking about extreme cases where people are in a violent relationship. Let's exclude those. But I'm talking about, like, what does it mean to constantly give your partner the benefit of the doubt when you used to not? What does it mean to lean into the good and what they do for you? What does it mean to lean into doing more for them and not scorecarding? I think that's maybe some start.
Very nice. It's very nice. So I think that part of what impresses me about this parsha is just the first word, Breshit. And that this is a religious tradition. First of all, it's a tradition. So there's Marc's sense of continuity, but it's a religious tradition obsessed with the power of beginning, with the power of breaking out of cycles, breaking out of ruts, breaking out of a sense of being stuck and anchored in a pattern of life and starting again. Breshit bara Elohim, the world begins all over again. So let's turn now and talk to this idea of creation. Now, we live in a moment in human history, of course, when science has come and given us a whole new myth of creation, big bangs and evolution. So when we open the Torah's story, what is a modern Jew to read in this story of creation? Mark, what do we read in creation?
Well, what we read in creation is the notion that we're not alone and that we are in a world, a created world. That's the fundamental choice between paganism and all the religions of the world, which is, are we just alone in a material world filled with goo, whether it's genetic goo or whatever, or are we in a world in which we are not alone, but there is what the Greeks call telos. There's a purpose, there's a designer, there's an arc toward freedom, as King called it. And that's the choice we have to make. Are we alone or are we in a created world? And if we are in a created world, then the act of creation means that everything we do is done in the presence of the Creator, and everything we touch is created by God. And so that produces other spiritual developments like gratitude. Oh yes, this food was created by God, and I'm grateful for that. Or this world was created by God, so I can't just pollute it. I can't destroy it. It's not just a resource for me. That's the point. We're partners in the act of creation. And the rabbis debated that, in the creation story. Why were we created last? So that we wouldn't, they say one version is, so they say, look, the roaches were created before you. So let's just not get so high and mighty. The second is, so you wouldn't say you were a partner. But when I wrote my Midrash Partners in the book, Does God Have a Big Toe? I took the opposite view. We are partners. We are partners with God. And that goes back to this issue of rebooting. For us, the act of rebooting, it seems to me, is always confronts the fact that we're rebooting existing things. We're rebooting us and our history and our passions and our fears. There is only one being in the universe who reboots nothing, from nothing to everything, and that's God. And so I think a great deal on Bereshit, at least, because I like thinking about abstract ideas. I don't see everything as psychologized, that having to be about me and people and me and me and me. Sometimes just the idea of God alone creating, to me, fills me with wonder, and has filled me with wonder in my meditations this week. This idea that God is the only thing, the only being that can create out of nothingness, creatio ex nihilo. And even Hebrew conveys that understanding between the verb asa and bara, which isn't totally consistent, but in general, asa is creating out of existing stuff, and bara is creating, only God does it. So I think there's a piece of this creation lesson, which is everything is a creation, and you are touching God in some manner when you touch anything in the world.
That's beautiful. That's really beautiful.
I'm on a roll this week.
No, your meditations have been fruitful.
Yeah,
Sherry, when you read the creation story, what do you read in the story? What strikes you, especially as a modern Jew?
Professor Benjamin Sommer taught me, who's at JTS, he's a Bible instructor, is this idea that we have a sense of indebtedness to God, right? That God didn't have to create us. God could have created this world and done everything and left us out of the entire equation. And as a result, because God created us, that we are born in debt to God. Now, it's not in debt like, we owe God a certain financial compensation. It's in fact the opposite. It's like, we need to take this role seriously. We need to become a partner in creation and further the work that God's doing has created for us and put forth. And I love this idea that, like, I owe a debt to God, and that is the gift of being created. And my responsibility, which I think Mark spoke so beautifully about, is with creation comes obligation. My responsibility or obligation is to further creation and to make the world better. And that's what I love about, I love so much about Bereshit.
When I read this story, one of the questions that struck me, and this is going to sound very pedantic, but why a garden? If God creates
Like, why not a
animals,
parking lot?
yeah, God creates animals and puts them in a world. You know, it figures that the bears are going to find caves and the tigers are going to find jungles, right? But when God creates human beings, God creates a setting. God creates a garden. And of all things, why a garden? Why not a palace or a city or a fortress or some other kind of place? And the answer, I think, this is my speculation, is that a garden is the most beautiful symbol of the coming together of artifice and nature. And that the garden represents a quality which I think is a theme throughout the Genesis chapters, the theme of oneness. When God begins creating the world, Yehi Or, he just breathes reality into the world. There's no consonant in that sentence until you get to the resh at the end. God just, it's not like God makes light. God just breathes light into the world. So there's a fundamental oneness between God and the world. And then God creates the human being. And there's two stories, of course. The first one says we're created b'tselem, in the image of God. So we are the representation of God walking around in the world. And in the other one, God makes us out of the dust of the earth. So human beings and earth are created of the same stuff. That's where the word human comes from the word humus, meaning the stuff of the earth, schmutz. And then God breathes the breath of life into the human being. So we carry God's breath inside of us. So there is a oneness between us and God and between us and the world. And then finally, there's two stories of the creation of woman, opposite man. In the first story, man and woman are created together in the same gesture. So we are one. And in the second story, of course, woman is taken from the side of man, the tsela, right? And she is created as his ezer kenegdo, as his mate and his help. So we are one with each other. And this oneness between God and the world, between God and humanity, between humanity and the world, and between man and woman, this is the opening scene in the entire biblical corpus. It's like if you look at the world and all of its mess right now and run it backwards, what the Torah is telling you is if you run the story, if you would run the film backwards, you would get to a point, a singularity where all is one. And that's a reminder that no matter how broken the world may be, its oneness, its wholeness is still latent within it. And therefore, tikkun is always a possibility. And the whole purpose of the corpus of the Torah, this is the answer to Rashi's question, why do you start with Bereshit? Because the whole purpose of it is, how do you return the world to oneness? How do you bring human beings together to live as one? How do you bring human beings together with the planet to live as one? How do you bring human beings and the world to God to live as one? And that, I think, is the ultimate story of what the Garden of Eden is really about.
But the question you started with was so beautiful. Why the garden? The garden's a place of reboot. It's a place of renewal. It's a restarting, right? It's constantly renewing itself. And here, what you're saying is, in order to become one with yourself, it is a constant state of renewing and reassessing to the ultimate place where you're truly connected to God. Beautiful.
Right. And it's a place between, again, it's a meeting place. If you're anybody who does gardening, it's a combination of artifice, of planning and design, and then letting nature do its thing. And which is such an interesting metaphor about how human beings grow. Sherre, you have 5 or 6 or 7 beautiful children that you're responsible for. I lose count. And you and Jeff have worked so hard to shape them, but in a certain way, they shape you back and they become who they're meant to be.
Right. And there's a wildness to it. There's if there's any book to read for parents, it's called Wildhood by Barbara Natterson. It's incredible. She's a cardiologist. She doesn't want it as a parenting book, but I think it's the most important parenting book there is. But there's a wildness to the garden, right? You plant the seeds, you do everything, but then there's a wildness. And we saw that with Adam and Eve. They were a little bit wild, playing with the serpent, right? Like I would say that's the excitement of the garden too, and the unexpected surprise of it.
Gellman, you have something on your mind. I can see it in your face.
Yeah. I'm not a garden fan. I'm sorry. I think the garden.
You don't like gardens? What does that mean? I don't like
No,
gardens. You
no.
don't like believe in gardens?
He
What
lives on a golf course.
All
Don't
of the
you
above.
understand?
I don't like them. I don't believe in them. The
Yeah,
garden.
like,
You like golf courses?
Yeah, and golf
Yeah,
courses are
I like
manicured
it.
gardens.
Because of the quest. I like the quest. And that's sort of the point I wanted to get to, which is God isn't creating the garden. That's wrong. God created the garden with a tree in the middle of it.
Mhm.
That's the key to the garden. Because without the tree in the middle of the knowledge of good and evil, man and woman are like fish or antelope or whales, none of whom have any sense that they're part of a creation. They are part of creation, but they have no consciousness of it. So God's saying, look, in order for this to work, in order for this to fulfill my perfection, I need someone to be aware that they are not part of nature, that there's a part of them that is not part of nature, just as they need to be aware that I am not nature. I created nature, but I am not nature. And that distinction is the unique Jewish
But Mark, then
theological belief.
why did God have the tree, a piece of nature, be what helps them discover that they're not part of a nature? Why did
Well,
God, as Eddie say, pick something else?
Yes, because the tree isn't actually a tree. It's a symbol. It's a symbol of the knowledge of good and evil. Plus, there's a second tree, which is the eternal life thing. And that's why they got expelled. So the point is, God wants them, in a way, to choose. You can have a perfect life as a fish in the garden without any consciousness of me or anything. And that's the oneness you're talking about, which I don't agree with. And they didn't agree with it, thank God. And the second is you
No pun intended.
you can become completely human. And that involves risk. It involves a betrayal of your holiness at times when you do evil things. But it involves a growing understanding that no creature in nature has. And that is that I am real and I created everything and you're a part of it. And with your free will to do good, you can help make it better and be my partner in creation. That's the point of the tree. But it comes with a risk. God knew the risk. People had no idea about the risk. They just bumbled into it because of the snake. And in the end, they became human. But in becoming human, which is knowing good and evil, they couldn't stay in the garden. You see, Eddie? That's the thing. They couldn't remain in nature and still have the knowledge of good and evil, because there is no good and evil in nature. You know, lions eat antelopes. They don't eat guilty antelopes. They eat antelopes. And that's the way it is.
I just
But
have this visual of like 3 lions,
and
like a
there's a
painting,
trial.
and antelopes
Yeah.
with like their own little witnesses, you know?
Yeah, you ate from my tree, I'm eating you.
Wait, you
No.
actually took a bite of that actual territory. I mean, that was just so funny.
I had a midrash that I'm writing on that. But the point is, we emerge out of the garden. And the question, the great question of Bereshit, the unanswered question is, was this really a fall, the Christian take, or is it an affirmation of our unique humanity, the Erich Fromm Jewish take, which is my take as well, that in fact, had they remained in the garden, they would have abandoned any possibility of knowing God or having any spiritual or moral integrity of any kind. It was only when they ate the fruit, accepted the harshness of the world outside, but accepted its rewards, because they were rewards that they earned. In the garden, everything was provided for them. But outside the garden, they had to earn their life and earn their truth. Through struggle, through ignorance, through evil, through all the things the obstacles that we have to enlightenment. All of that was outside the garden, but all of that makes us human. That's my take.
I read it a little differently. I appreciate that. And it's a different take on the same thing. The garden represents childhood. It's the unconscious state. It's enjoying the world. Everything's provided to you. You're not conscious of yourself. It's the unself-conscious being. If you ever watch a little kid run around, take off their clothes, run through the sprinklers, completely unself-conscious. It's a beautiful way to be when you're about 2 years old or 4 years old. But the question then is, what happens when a person individuates and gains consciousness? And the story in the Torah, the snake says to the woman, are you allowed to eat from any tree? And she said, yeah, except that one. And the snake says, yeah, but because God knows that if you eat from that one, you're going to be like God. And then there's this wonderful verse where it says, she saw the tree as good for eating. Now, how do you see something good for eating? It's hard to know, but she sees it all of a sudden. And she desires it as a source of knowledge, and she craves it. And what's happening in that verse is that she wakes up as an individual. She realizes her selfhood. She realizes her self-consciousness at that point. It's not the tree that turns it. We all gain a moment of self-consciousness.
Yeah, it's the fruit
and
from the
right. And we break out of the unconsciousness of childhood. I think that it's part of our own self-creation. It's the input. Remember, God makes us a partner in creation. And what happens is we turn that inward and decide we will create ourselves. All of us want to create ourselves. Sherry's going through this with a whole house full of teenagers right now. They want to create themselves. They want to dress the way they want to dress and think the way they want to think and explore the world on their own. And you want to throw your arms around them and protect them and keep them in the garden. And they want to get out and see the world and get involved in it. And that's what that moment is. It's a moment of rebellion that every child goes through to break away from the unconsciousness of childhood into the consciousness of adulthood. The benefit is what Mark said. We become partners with God. The detriment is we become aware of all of the terrors of being a human being, including the terrors of mortality, the terrors of death. And that's what distinguishes us from everything else. But the question is, if you want to remain a child, you stay in the garden. If you want to grow up and leave, you go out. Now, the question the Torah then asks is a really interesting question. Can I go back to the garden? Can I return to the garden and its oneness? Can I return to the garden and its joy? Can I return to the garden and its peace and its wholeness without losing my individuality, without losing myself, without losing my self-consciousness? And that, I think, I'm going to suggest to you, that's the whole project of the Torah. What is Shabbat? Shabbat is a return to the garden for 25 hours. What do we say at the end of life? Began Eden tehe menuchatam. Let our loved ones be gathered into the garden. Let oneness once again be our reward. And the whole idea of creating a world that resembles the garden is what the whole project of the mitzvot is all about. And it's how do you create a world much like the garden, but a world made of individuated human beings is the great struggle of the Torah, the moral struggle of the Torah. Sherry, go ahead, please.
You just made me realize it's this age-old question of how is it that I'm completely individuated in the world? And then I get back with my high school friends or back in my sibling relationships, and I go back to that pre-leaving the garden state, right? Where I'm like completely reverting. And I think one of what you said so beautifully, Eddie, is we all have this desire to quest where we can be individuated and go back and still maintain our individuation, right? And our individuality, forgive me. So it's like, that is the quest. And then when we get there and we go back to the garden, but we own ourselves, is really when we have that oneness with God because we feel truly at peace. This is beautiful, Eddie.
What's the first thing that happens after we get kicked out of the garden? The man turns to his wife and they conceive a child. The first answer to get back to the garden as an individuated human being is love.
Is creation
is,
too.
is love and love making and creation and family, because these are all experiences of losing the self, but not completely. Love is a matter of losing the self. I give myself to another. I give my heart to another.
Or just connecting deeply to create something greater
You
than self.
bring a child into the world, you lose yourself. God knows,
Right.
you know.
Oh, I
And
can tell you that as
yeah,
the
yes.
conversations that happened in my house last night.
So the moral question of the opening chapters of Genesis is, how can I get closer to the garden experience without losing the wisdom of being an adult? Is there some way? And I think that the most lovely symbol of this goes like this, right? Remember how we get thrown out of the garden? So we get tossed out and God puts this fiery angel, or an angel with a fiery sword, at the gate. So now suppose you're walking down Wilshire Boulevard and you come to the corner of Wilshire Boulevard and Eden Avenue, and you look up Eden Avenue and there's the gate to the garden. And right behind the gate, there's the tree of life. And there's this angel with this fiery sword. So if you look at the two of them, they sort of superimpose on each other. It sort of looks like the tree is on fire, but it's not burning up. Where do I know that from? A tree that burns and isn't burned up. That's what called Moses to liberate his people and bring them to Canaan. And then Moses is taught to make a menorah. Mark writes a beautiful sermon about this one. And what is the menorah? It's decorated with flowers and fruit and leaves. It looks like a tree. And when you light it, it lights up. It's a tree that burns and isn't burned up. It's the tree of life. And that becomes the eternal symbol of the Jewish people. The menorah is the eternal symbol. You find it on the sarcophagus in Rome. You find it over the oldest synagogue in Prague. You find it across the street from the Knesset. And what do we call the Torah? We call it Eitz Chaim, the tree of life. So the whole project of the tradition is to get past that angel, get back into that garden, but not as children, as adults, and to find oneness again in this world.
Or
oh no, don't ruin it. That was such a nice thing.
Or find
or
oneness in the world to come.
Okay, there you go.
God
That's
forbid
fair.
we don't mention the world to come.
No, that's fair. That Mark
That's
is
fair.
fair.
And that's the only way we can find the oneness. That's the point.
That's fair. So I want to finish with a difficult question. You ready? At the end of the parsha begins with all this promise, but it ends in sadness. By the time we get to the end of the parsha, right, the 4th, 5th chapter of the Genesis, God is giving up on the world, and God is disappointed in us. And the last thing that happens in the parsha is that Noah is born. So there's a rebirth again, restart. What do you make of that? Why does the Torah go from the heights of this beautiful image of oneness to the kind of disappointment that God has in the world, and leave us this next week with a sense of, oh my God, is the world going to get saved? What do you think, Mark?
Well, I think the two experiments of the Torah both fail, but they are the two most noble experiments that only a perfect being would want to conduct, and that's God. And the two experiments were the experiment of individual freedom in the garden and the experiment of collective freedom with the Exodus. Both fail. And yet both succeed, in the sense that the individual freedom from the garden gives us the capacity to now
Just throw it against a wall. That's what I do.
I know.
Yeah.
The individual experiment of freedom fails. There's 10 generations from Adam to Noah, 10 from Noah to Abraham, and it's a complete downward move because the people weren't ready for personal freedom. And then the failure of the Exodus is also a failure, that the people disobey and they can't keep the land, and they get expelled from the land. So, but it's still the only quest that matters to God, and it's the only quest that should matter to us. And that is, how do we handle individual freedom and collective freedom? And that's the two great challenges of the Torah. And frankly, It's the challenge of every world religion. I mean, enlightenment for a Buddhist is the triumph of freedom to choose wisdom over suffering. And so ultimately the task of human existence is the task of accommodating freedom to free will. It's the most beautiful struggle, but it's the most humane struggle, and it's what differentiates us from the animals. And I think it's the proof that God is real, because only a perfect being would give us such a wondrous and eternal quest.
Thank you. That was beautiful.
That was very
Sherry,
beautiful.
the parsha ends depressing, in a depressing
I
note.
saw it
How do
very
you
differently.
Okay.
I feel like it's the story of each of us. We start with all this idealism and all this like optimism and possibility, and then we have an experience and it doesn't come out exactly like we want, and we feel disappointment. And this is just the beginning of the humanity of the Torah, right? This is the beginning of the story of, I'm not telling you a story. This isn't the story of how I did it perfectly and everything worked out, and now you should go and emulate me. This is the story of humanity. And I started out with all this idealism and what it was going to be. It didn't come out the way I wanted. Now I'm going to do it again. And I'm going to do it again. And I actually think we just get a snippet of the beginning of the longer story.
Very nice. Very good. The story is a story, I think, in 3 acts. It begins with a God that has a dream of a world of oneness and creates a human being to share it. But that human being isn't ready to do that, because that human being is so committed to his own individuation that he turns his back on God's dream of oneness. And when God says, I can't do this anymore, he's about to destroy it all. And he finds one human being who might share it with him, named Noah. So he said, I couldn't create a human being to be a partner. Maybe I can choose one. And so he chooses this one. He tries again. But this one doesn't work out either, because there's something inside of him that just isn't ready for this. I think Marc's idea of freedom is very important. So then the third experiment comes in our third Torah portion. We'll do this in 2 weeks. God says, I couldn't create one. I couldn't create a partner. I couldn't choose a partner. Maybe I can teach one. And he chooses a person named Abraham. And he says, Lech lecha me'artzecha. I want you to leave what you know and follow me in the world. And I'm going to teach you to be a blessing, a vessel of blessing in the world. And that experiment is ongoing. That's the great experiment. Can we become a vessel of God's vision of oneness in the world? Can we teach the world to do that? Can we overcome all of the temptations of radical individuation, where we turn our backs on each other and forget how much we share, in order to embrace one another and create the world that God dreamed of? To be seen, to be continued. That's the great question.
Love
To
that.
be continued. Well, thank you for listening this morning. I want to wish everybody a really, really good Shabbat Breshit and a good beginning, a good restart. Thank you to Rabbi Sherry, to Rabbi Marc, and thank you to everyone who's listening. Following this, of course, service from Valley Beth Shalom this morning. Mincha Mariv tonight at 6 o'clock. All week we have tefillah online and in person at Valley Beth Shalom. And our learning series is going to be starting very soon. You'll be hearing about that. Marc, good night, good morning, good day. Sherry, good Shabbos.
Shabbos.
Take good care.
Good Shabbos.